Good evening. My name is Jean Nagelkirk, and I'm the Vice Provost for Health at Grand Valley State University. On behalf of Grand Valley, I'm pleased to welcome you to the DeVos Medical Ethics Colloquy titled The Role of Religion in Healthcare. This colloquy series brings national experts to our community to assist us in discussing and grappling with thorny ethical issues that healthcare workers face in providing care for their patients. We're pleased that you have joined us and look forward to our expert panelist presentation and a robust question and answer period. Grand Valley is pleased to host this colloquy as we are the major provider of healthcare professionals in the West Michigan area. We play a vital role in educating and shaping the future healthcare workforce for our region and the state. For these students, ethics is an important component of their education as they become skilled practitioners. And for community members and healthcare providers, ethics is prevalent in their day-to-day work and treatment decisions for patient care. A special thank you to the Richard and Helen DeVos Foundation for providing the opportunity for Grand Valley to continue this vital series for the community. We will always remember Rich DeVos as one of the great Grand Valley leaders. I would also like to recognize the late Dr. Louise Tomatis, who developed and initiated the Colloquy series, provided leadership to the Colloquy Organizing Committee, and who dedicated his time and talent to the success of the Colloquy. I am grateful for the Colloquy Organizing Committee, their commitment and dedication to the success of this event, and to Diane Dykstra, our Special Projects Coordinator, for her commitment and hard work to make each of our events successful. We appreciate the continued support and generosity of our sponsors for the Colloquy series. The principal sponsors are Spectrum Health in Grand Valley, and the major sponsors are Mercy Health and Metro Health, University of Michigan Health. We recognize their ongoing commitment to medical ethics education for our community. Now, please welcome Dr. Farr, the Secretary of the Colloquy Committee, who will provide opening remarks. Dr. Farr?
Jean, thank you so much. And thank you to Grand Valley and to you, Jean, for the continued sustainability of the colloquy. And also thank you so much to the Colloquy Committee who decides on subjects and chooses speakers, and especially to Jeff Burns and the people that get it done, Diane Dykstra and Sarah Walker. As Jean mentioned, the colloquy was thought of in 2004 when Rich DeVos mentioned to Luis Tomatis that we should have something about bioethics in Grand Rapids. Unfortunately, we lost Mr. DeVos, who's seated in this picture, in September of 2018. And then we lost Dr. Tomatis in September of 2020. Thanks to Gabriela Tomatis, Luis's daughter, and her husband, Ted Vecchio, we're showing the picture that Dr. Tomatis always kept on his credenza right in back of his desk. We need to remember these two wonderful and giving and ethical men. Now, it's my pleasure at this time to introduce a person I consider a Renaissance man, Dr. Doug Kindschi. He's in his 45th year at Grand Valley State University and served as a dean for 28 years. He's currently University Professor of Mathematics and Philosophy, as well as the director of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute. While Dean of Science, he was responsible for 14 departments, including basic sciences, mathematics, computer science, the School of Engineering, School of Health Professions, and the Water Resources Institute. In August of 2015, Grand Valley named its new science center the P. Douglas Kindschi Hall of Science, recognizing his role. He received his bachelor's degree in mathematics from Houghton College in New York, did graduate study at the Divinity School, University of Chicago, and received his MA and PhD degrees in mathematics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He also completed a minor in philosophy as part of his doctoral study. Without further ado, Dr. Kindschi will moderate tonight's discussion and introduce our speakers. Doug?
Thank you, Dr. Farr. That's way too much information than most people want to know, but I appreciate your comments. I want to welcome back those that were part of the conference this afternoon. It was a very stimulating and helpful discussion, and those of you who are part of it, I know you appreciate it as well. We're really excited to hear from our major speakers this evening. Both are nationally recognized in bioethicists, widely publicized. Their bios are on your link on your welcome page if you want to know more information about them. I'll be introducing them briefly in just a minute. But first, a little bit about our process here. Each speaker will speak approximately 30 minutes, and then the next speaker will follow. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A session. If you'd like to make a question, please use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen and enter your question there. The question is not available to all of the viewers, but it is available to the panel and to those of us who are moderating. So we encourage your Q&A anytime during the presentations or any point that you want to add those. Our first speaker, but both of our speakers, as I say, are recognized and well published, and we're really pleased to have them with us. First speaker is Dr. Anna Iltis, a professor of philosophy with her PhD in philosophy. She directs the Center for Bioethics, Health, and Society at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. She is the president of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities and serves on editorial boards of both the Journal for Medicine and Philosophy and the Annals of Bioethics book series. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Dr. Iltis for the first presentation this evening. Dr. Iltis.
Thank you so much. It is really such a privilege and a pleasure to be with you all tonight. So thank you for having me. My goal tonight is to offer a plausible account of how we came to find ourselves where we are today with respect to repeated calls to excise religion and religious commitments from healthcare, and especially from how we address ethical issues that arise in healthcare. There is a deep desire among some people working in healthcare ethics today to deny the reality or the legitimacy of deep moral differences, and instead to insist that they have privileged access to an account of morality that all reasonable people can, do, or should subscribe to. The views of patients, and especially of healthcare professionals, that are in tension with this so-called common morality are deemed illegitimate or, at best, worthy of less consideration. So I'll begin by identifying some problems with the present state of affairs, and then I want to give you an account of how I think we got here, at least one account. The first problem is this. Meet the approximately 331 plus million people with whom you share the United States, never mind the many other people with whom we share the world. Claims about the possibility of consensus or the existence of a common morality are deeply exaggerated, even among secular contributors to bioethics. Consider, for example, the efforts in Oregon over the years to expand the basic level of healthcare available to more people by developing a list of health services that Medicaid would and would not cover in Oregon. Many people liked the idea that to engage the public in developing this list, there was more transparency and more public input into what were clearly rationing decisions that otherwise would be made behind the scenes. The reality, however, of making those kinds of decisions and drawing lines was anything but smooth. Right? If you want to experience the difference that emerged in priority setting, you might consider using the chat, choosing all together exercise that was developed at the University of Michigan, and there's more information available about that online. Ongoing differences about how to allocate kidneys in the United States illustrate that allocation debates exist even with regard to a narrow range of decisions and even among people who are considered experts in the field. Allocation arrangements involve numerous value judgments, such as the priority that should be given to considerations of fair access and how to understand fair access in the first place, as well as to maximizing life years and maximizing graft survival. As some experts have pointed out, such judgments must be informed by data, but reliable data alone cannot tell us what the appropriate or ethical way to allocate kidneys would look like. One might minimize the significance of such disputes by claiming that these are differences at the margins or about the application of a shared morality rather than about the underlying moral commitments or norms that we already do hold in common. If that's the case, at some point, the common morality becomes trivial. In other words, it might be true that people share norms, but they understand and apply them in such different ways that it's not terribly meaningful to say that they are shared norms. If we agree that healthcare professionals ought to do good and avoid harm, but we have radically different understandings of what is good and what is harmful, and whether there are any actions that we may not perform no matter what good might come from them, then the norms we share, namely doing good and avoiding harm, don't get us very far. Think about a group of people from the US and from Spain agreeing to get together for a game of football. Others might hold that we have consensus despite these differences because consensus does not require unanimity. Consensus involves the conclusions of a proper deliberative process that results in a decision. The process confers legitimacy on that decision, earning it the label of consensus, even though some people may disagree. Consider what one scholar offered as a justification for moving forward with human embryo research policy that would allow embryo destructive research, something that many people with various religious commitments will object to. This is from Patricia King. While public policy appropriately should acknowledge the broad range of moral perspectives about the status of the embryo, complete moral consensus on when life or personhood begins is neither feasible nor necessary for formulation of ethically acceptable public policy for human embryo research. Significant agreement on limited areas of social practice that is supported by diverse but overlapping moral frameworks also provides a moral foundation for standards that guide social conduct. Despite intense disagreement about the moral status of the embryo, a policy grounded in overlapping consensus is feasible for human embryo research and should be encouraged. It is sufficient, in other words, to secure a degree of agreement through deliberation among persons one deems reasonable. One may then plant the consensus flag and deploy its authority to justify decisions. In short, claims to consensus and to the significance of the so-called common morality are greatly exaggerated. Consensus of this sort is achieved by excluding the right people and views. Religious views, many working in bioethics believe, fall outside of the sphere of legitimate contributions, or at least of the contributions that must be taken seriously when they are in tension with the dominant secular commitments that have already been adopted. So this is one problem with the current state of affairs, a state of affairs in which many people seek to excise religion and religious commitments from healthcare deliberation. Second, meet a 71-year-old widower I'll call Maury and his adult daughters whom I'll call Tia and Blossom. This is based on a case in which I was peripherally involved a number of years ago. Tia and Blossom and their children, Maury's grandchildren, live with Maury in their home. He had undergone coronary artery bypass surgery several weeks before the events unfolded. He had developed a MRSA infection and sepsis that led to respiratory failure and kidney failure. He was now on a ventilator, receiving dialysis in the ICU, certainly unable to make his own healthcare decisions. The team believed that it was time to discontinue aggressive treatment because they believed they were only prolonging the dying process. They started recommending that he have a DNR order in place. No one was using DNA-R at the time. Tia and Blossom vehemently disagreed with any decision that might shorten their father's life and wanted everything done that might extend his life, even by a short time. Nothing should be withheld. A nurse involved in Maury's care was suspicious that they were trying to keep their father alive for financial reasons. He had learned that Tia, Blossom, and their children lived with Maury and depended on his pension and Social Security income. Without that, they would be unable to continue living in their father's home, which was located in a good school district, something they deemed essential for their children. They also expressed concern about surviving day to day and taking care of their children without their father's support. After multiple failed attempts to revise Maury's goals of care, the nurse shared his suspicions with others involved. The attending physician requested an ethics consult. During the family meeting, the ethics consultant asked Tia and Blossom what they thought their father would want, trying to invoke a substituted judgment assessment on their part. The women insisted that their father would want to be treated with everything that might extend his life, even for a short period of time, and that he would want to take advantage of every opportunity available to him. Eventually, someone confronted Tia and Blossom with their suspicions that their desire to keep Maury alive was financially motivated. One of the daughters responded with something along the following lines. "Of course! That's exactly why my father would want to do everything to stay alive. He knows how much we depend on him. He has always taken care of everyone. That is who he is. He loves his grandchildren more than anything. He wants the best for them. He worked hard for that pension. My father would want to do everything he possibly could for his family. You asked us what he would want, and I am telling you there is no doubt this is what he would want." Everyone was silent. Without knowing it, Tia and Blossom were relying on a substituted judgment standard for surrogate decision-making, exactly what they were expected to do in the absence of previously articulated wishes. The healthcare team didn't like it. They could not wrap their heads around the fact that the family openly admitted that their desire for aggressive treatment was financially motivated. The team set out to find a different way to deal with them because they had come to the consensus that Maury should not be treated aggressively. The case offers one example of fundamentally different starting points for the ranking of values, for the importance patients may attribute to families in formulating their preferences and making healthcare decisions, and the extent to which decisions by surrogates making informed judgments about what they think a patient would choose should be respected. This family's priorities and the patient's, by extension, were deemed unacceptable. Rejecting particular views of the good and rankings of values reflects different underlying assumptions of these very things. All attempts at determining what we ought to do and what we ought not to do require a starting point and include assumptions about what is good and bad, beneficial, harmful, right, wrong, and how to rank goods. All attempts at normativity are grounded in particular moral, cultural, and historical contexts, and all rest on assumptions that cannot be proven through reason or deliberation alone. Thus, despite claims to the contrary, contemporary bioethics or contemporary healthcare ethics has not discovered a shared moral vision that transcends moral perspectives and that can guide all healthcare decision-making. These are not just examples of disagreements that illustrate that there are differences and that these differences persist, but to underscore the depth, the source, and the significance of difference. These disputes cannot be resolved by sound rational argument or democratic deliberation or informed civil discourse or an appeal to shared moral commitments or anything else. In short, all moral judgment requires a foundation, a starting point. Moral content does not come from nowhere, and privileging some sources over others ignores the reality that we cannot use reason alone or deliberation alone to establish a single starting point. Notice that that is different from claiming that one is correct and others are mistaken. One can believe that there is a truth, a moral truth to the matter, and still recognize the importance and depth of these differences. Third, and finally, a largely secularized bioethics that claims to have discovered a common morality and that through various forms of deliberation can resolve ethical questions in healthcare and health policy authoritatively paves the way for biopolitics, a concept that was introduced by Foucault and which, in the words of Professor Teresa Lysott, refers to the social strategy of policing and controlling populations by increasingly ordering all realms of their under the guise of improving the welfare of the individual and the population for the purposes of reproducing and furthering the social order. Claims about consensus on matters related to healthcare have been used by the state to establish policies related to bioethics, by others in authority, such as health professions or associations and organizations, to promulgate guidelines, standards, and expectations of conduct, and at the individual level to exert authority and promote particular views of the good that always under the guise of a shared morality or a shared understanding and commitment to the good. To illustrate how how patients might experience bioethics as biopolitics, meet Claire and her mother, Mimi. In April of 2006, Mimi, then 18 weeks pregnant with her third child, went for a routine ultrasound. The baby was a girl, and Claire would be her name. She was diagnosed with encephalocele. A portion of Claire's brain was outside the skull. Mimi and her husband Tito were advised to set up a genetic counseling appointment, and they were shown pictures of children with severe abnormalities. Thus began a visit to specialists, each of whom encouraged Mimi to terminate the pregnancy. They were told that the child's brain would be spilling out of the head and that the situation was hopeless. One doctor told them that anything they did for this baby would be like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. The only medically indicated solution was abortion. Mimi experienced immense pressure to abort her child in the name of doing the right thing, doing what was medically indicated, doing the compassionate thing, and ultimately in the name of love. One doctor told her, "Think of the burden you are placing on your two other children." Talk about mom guilt. The physicians Mimi and Tito encountered at different institutions repeatedly attempted to motivate them with fear and guilt, really, to pursue their account of what was ethical, responsible, and compassionate. When she refused to have an abortion, Mimi was told that she should not have a C-section, which might be essential for saving Claire's life. Just let nature take its course. Claire was delivered by C-section. The APGAR score for this hopeless baby who would be severely disabled and better off dead? 9.9. She had a small sac at the base of her head. That was removed at 2 months of age, and today, Claire is a healthy teen. Consensus claims in clinical encounters can be used aggressively to advance particular accounts of morality and of the good. This does not only happen at the level of individuals, however. Consensus claims by physician groups drive recommendations for prenatal screening and prenatal diagnosis, including the guidelines on who should be subjected to screening and testing and what such exams should and should not look for. By providing or requiring coverage for certain areas of prenatal screening and prenatal diagnosis and promoting messaging that encourages their use, women are not merely told that they may access these services, but that it is part of basic pregnancy care. Failure to screen is a failure to obtain basic care, something all good mothers, of course, are expected to do. When detected, or even when an increased risk of certain conditions is present, women must be offered the opportunity and in some cases even encouraged to end their pregnancies. Underlying judgments about prenatal screening and prenatal diagnosis often are undisclosed views of particular goods, of what should be detected prenatally and what should not, of what kinds of diagnoses might warrant or even really require abortion. Just so that you can appreciate how idiosyncratic sometimes these views can be, I'll share a personal story. I had an ultrasound at about 21 weeks and was told that the baby might have cleft lip and cleft palate. The initial concern was immediately followed by the following statement by a maternal fetal medicine specialist: "Don't worry, you can still terminate at this stage for a disability." I never would have thought of cleft lip and cleft palate as fitting in that category. Though through claims of consensus and privileged knowledge, allegedly neutral and objective medical judgments and the so-called bioethical consensus are used to promote and even to impose a particular count of the good. In short, an essential step in securing a common morality and consensus is jettisoning religion and religious insights, or at least all those religious insights that do not overlap with and cannot be described in terms of the particular secular ethical commitments that are being advanced. Yet losing sight of religion involves losing sources of moral challenge, of insight into the human condition, and of the reality that moral diversity is real. Those who claim to have identified a common morality to which all reasonable persons can or should subscribe are mistaken. These claims pose a grave threat to religious commitments and to individuals of faith. So how did we get here, given the historical relationship between religion and healthcare? Religion and religious thinkers have played a role in the history of contemporary bioethics, by which I mean conversations happening in the 1960s and 1970s regarding abortion, ventilators, organ transplantation, and many other things. I am not a historian, and I will not pretend to be one. I am, however, someone who appreciates the importance of history and context. For anyone interested in the topic of the role of religion in the history of Western medicine, I highly recommend this book by Gary Ferngren called Medicine and Religion. In his recounting, Ferngren's recounting of ancient Hebrew medicine, for example, he reminds us of the importance of Jewish law places on preserving health and on saving life. He notes the importance of religious prohibitions against infanticide and castration, of ritual purity and dietary laws, and of the role of priests in quarantining persons suspected of having leprosy and ultimately diagnosing them. The Jewish philosopher Maimonides contributed extensively to medical knowledge in the Middle Ages. The earliest Christians understood that out of love, they should visit the sick and care for the poor. They did this not only as individuals, instead they organized a system through which local congregations cared for the sick. These structures grew, and ultimately the earliest hospitals were founded largely under the guidance of St. Basil the Great. He famously praised medicine and listed it among the arts given to us by God, quote, to relieve the sick in some degree at least. He also warned that medicine should not be turned into an idol, and that one should attempt to save life at all costs. All goods that medicine pursues, such as curing disease, relieving pain and suffering, and postponing death, had to be situated within the pursuit of holiness of God, for St. Basil. Early Christians rejected abortion, infanticide, castration, and euthanasia. More recently in the West, the Roman Catholic Church, particularly through the work of religious women, played a central role in delivering healthcare in the United States. Today, even with very few nuns, Catholic healthcare remains an essential part of the healthcare infrastructure of the United States. The Muslim world also has a long history that reflects an important relationship between healthcare and religion. This includes developing understandings of health and disease, along with dietary and sanitary laws to promote health and prevent disease, eventually building hospitals and medical schools and advancing medical knowledge in a range of areas. There is, of course, much more I could say, but the point should be clear. In the West, religion has featured prominently in the history of the understanding of health and the delivery of health care. Yet today we hear calls to keep religion out of healthcare, that religious commitments have no place in medicine or in evaluating ethical issues that arise in healthcare, that religious hospitals, and Roman Catholic ones in particular, should not be allowed to operate according to their own commitments and should get out of the business of healthcare altogether in some cases. Consider the recent claims of a scholar working in bioethics and that religion and bioethics simply are incompatible. Religion interferes with the ability of bioethics to do normative work, to figure out what might be right and what might be wrong. Where secular bioethics gets its account of what we should do and not do, why that source is legitimate and authoritative often remains unaddressed. The ethical questions that modern and high-tech science and medicine raise often ultimately are questions about how we understand health, disease, healing, how we respond to our own pain and suffering and that of others, what is appropriate and inappropriate, who counts as a human being, as a neighbor, and what that requires, prohibits, if anything. The idea that those questions not only may, but must be examined independently of religion, relying solely on some secular sources, is astonishing in light of the history of medicine and its relationship to religion. So how did we get here? Contemporary healthcare ethics emerged in the 1960s and 1970s, an era marked by significant changes in society and in healthcare, as some of you will no doubt remember. This includes widespread secularization in much of society, numerous challenges to authority and tradition, and an emphasis on individual choice. Healthcare became more effective and pricey, raising questions about how to allocate scarce resources. The advent of dialysis in Washington, for example, prompted formation of a committee colloquially called the God Committee or the God Squad. The King County appointed committee had 7 citizens: a lawyer, a minister, a banker, a housewife, a state government official, a labor leader, and a surgeon. They set some age-based criteria early on to determine who would receive dialysis and who would not. No one over the age of 45 and no children. But there were still more candidates than machines, so they added other considerations such as age, sex, marital status, number of children, income, emotional stability, kind of social worth kinds of characteristics, educational background, past performance, future performance, references. This is all outlined in a famous November 9th, 1962 Life magazine article that I really encourage you to read. The reporter tracked their experiences over the course of 6 months, and it's a fascinating piece of journalism. Controversies involving the beginning of life gripped society, especially abortion and in vitro fertilization in the late 1970s. Questions also arose about the end of life. Here, the case of Karen Ann Quinlan stands out. In April of 1975, at the age of 21, she was found in her home, not breathing. She was in a coma, had suffered irreversible brain damage, and was eventually in a persistent vegetative state. She was fed using artificial nutrition and hydration, and she was on a ventilator. Her parents believed that, given that there was no prospect of recovery, continued use of the ventilator was not appropriate. They sought to have it withdrawn, and the hospital refused, believing that hospital officials would be charged with homicide. In September of 1975, the parents filed a lawsuit asking that Karen Ann Quinlan, through her parents, who were serving as her surrogate decision makers, had a right to make a private decision about her long-term medical care. The court-appointed guardian for Quinlan insisted that withdrawal of the ventilator would constitute killing her. The first judge agreed. Her parents appealed to the New Jersey Supreme Court in a case that today remains famous. The court allowed the withdrawal of the ventilator. She continued breathing on her own until 1985. The case raised not only a legal question, but an ethical one. When, if ever, was it permissible to withdraw life-sustaining interventions from a living patient, and who should make those decisions? Finally, the public revelation in July of 1972 about the United States Public Health Service study of untreated syphilis at the Tuskegee Institute prompted significant developments that shaped contemporary bioethics. The study began in 1932 in Macon County, Alabama. It enrolled over 600 poor African-American men to study the course of untreated syphilis. When the study began in 1932, there were no proven treatments for syphilis. From 1947, when penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis, until 1972, when the study stopped after Jean Heller reported on it, the men in the study were actively denied access to penicillin. Their syphilis was left untreated for decades. In response to public outcry over the story, Congress passed the National Research Act, which, among other things, appointed the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Among the commission's charges was to conduct a comprehensive investigation and study to identify the basic ethical principles which should underlie the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. And they issued a number of reports that remain important today in research ethics. There was much at stake in healthcare for patients and families, for clinicians, for researchers, and for the public at large. These were not just interesting intellectual matters, though they were and remain so. They were real cases in which decisions had to be made. In the United States, we tend to value personal choice and freedom of thought, freedom of religion. This makes overtly imposing an ethic unacceptable, or at least the appearance of doing so, unpalatable. But interminable disagreement would not do. So the search was on for a mechanism to make decisions and craft policies that would be binding on all, despite deep differences, and while avoiding the appearance of avoiding violations of individual liberties, religion, and so on. So enter bioethics and its quest for the common morality. It is in the common morality project of bioethics that we find the roots of marginalizing religion in healthcare. Advancing the common morality project required cutting through moral pluralism. Diversity was like a brick wall standing in the way of hard decisions and decisive, authoritative, and universal ethical guidance. Scholars use the language of the common morality in different ways today. I'm using it here to refer to a range of views in and approaches to bioethics that appeal to things like principles, norms, rules, or values that allegedly are, or at least should be, shared among reasonable people, regardless of their particular background moral commitments. This allegedly shared morality can be used to make and justify substantive ethical decisions. The implication is that outliers are not reasonable. In the US, I think it's fair to say that the best and most widely cited allegedly shared principles are the 4 principles of biomedical ethics articulated by Beecham and Childress and widely taught in medical school: respect for autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. Some people also invoke concepts like dignity, human rights, or social justice as elements of a shared morality. What often goes unnoticed is that these concepts are informed by particular cultural and political commitments and substantive views of the good, rather than ideas delivered to us purely from reason alone. Kevin Wildes has referred to the common morality project of bioethics as, quote, the search for a secular or civic religion that might bind the sentiments of citizens who are at least nominally divided by religious, cultural, or other moral differences. Securing the common morality and the desired consensus on the ethical questions in healthcare required minimizing religious noise, to be sure. There were religious thinkers involved in those early discussions, but the extent to which they functioned as religious thinkers is debatable. Many people who have studied bioethics have suggested that while many leading voices in the early American bioethics had Christian or Jewish roots, and they identified as such, they were in many cases even religiously trained. Often they set aside their religious language and conformed to secular philosophical language, perhaps to gain and retain a space at the table. To the extent that religious language or insights interfered with the secular consensus being articulated, it would be unwelcome, and they knew it. The desire for consensus was so strong, I want to suggest, for at least 4 reasons. The first I've already mentioned. We don't want to be seen as imposing our moral views on others. It's un-American. Second, consensus sometimes gives us or others confidence that the decision is more likely to be right. Given the high stakes questions involved in the face of scandals in research, showing that there were shared norms and standards on which to build clinical practice and research could help to retain or restore lost trust. Third, making decisions collectively also may alleviate some sense of responsibility for the decision. Diluting personal responsibility for serious and sort of challenging ethical decisions can be comforting. We might think here of the God Committee I mentioned earlier. Fourth, consensus may confer authority to justify enforcing a decision or aggressively prodding other people to accept a recommendation. Having declared victory in allegedly identifying and articulating a universal account of bioethics, one that binds across secular, religious, and cultural lines, it no longer looked bad to dismiss dissenters. Dissenters operate outside the ethical boundaries that have been drawn by the so-called common morality. The claim to have discovered a common morality could be portrayed as a legitimate source of authority to govern healthcare and healthcare decisions. What I've tried to do tonight is to offer you a plausible account of how we traveled from a long history in which religion was central to healthcare, and religion and healthcare were intimately intertwined, to a place where we hear ongoing calls to excise religious considerations from healthcare and from healthcare ethics. Instead, an allegedly shared set of basic moral commitments is expected to inform and govern ethical decisions. For reasons I outlined at the beginning of my remarks tonight, this state of affairs is deeply problematic. Claims about consensus or a shared morality in healthcare are claims to power. They deny the reality or legitimacy of deep moral difference that cannot be overcome through sound rational argument or appeals to science. Such claims often take direct aim at religion and people of faith. I look forward to our ongoing discussion later this evening.
Thank you very much, Professor Iltis. You've given us so much to struggle with. I'm anxious to get to the questions and answers to pursue this further, but thank you.
Thank
Wonderful
you.
presentation. We'll turn now to our second presenter. That's we've heard from a professor of philosophy. Now we're going to hear from a medical doctor. Ryan Nash is the director of the Ohio State University Center for Bioethics. He has a faculty appointment in internal medicine and ongoing clinical work in the Department of Palliative Care. He serves on editorial boards of the Journal of Medicine and Philosophy and Christian Bioethics. Dr. Nash is certified by the American Board of Internal Medicine in hospice and palliative medicine. Dr. Nash, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. I only regret that I missed the joy of meeting people face to face and having the great conversations, but perhaps in future years. It is a great joy to follow my dear friend Anna Iltis. Professor Iltis and I have been friends for a long time. We come from similar backgrounds. Both are converts to Eastern Orthodox Church. Professor Iltis from Roman Catholicism and me from Reformed Protestantism. That's my only disclosure I have. It was also one of the easier talks for me to build, knowing that she would better articulate most of my points for me before I even begin. So as a starting point, first I want to give a little bit more commentary on context, and then I'm going to do what maybe clinicians should do, and that's to tell stories about patients to maybe bring greater understanding. The only thing I'll add to Professor Iltis's historical account of the context that we're in, and she mentions it, I think rightfully in this section of it's just un-American to kind of impose your religion on others. We can think about why that may be. I mean, reflect on whether that's a remnant from the 30 Years' War and the Peace at Westphalia, where Roman Catholics and Protestants had warred with no great gain, only loss to come from it. Maybe it's some of the humanist ideals. Maybe it's the fact that America is founded by heretics. I mean that in the sense that many of the founding communities of the Americas were fleeing religious persecution. They were deemed heretical, and the United States had to figure out after the colonial time and into colonial time how a Quaker and a Puritan could get along and live in peace, how an Anabaptist and a Zwinglian could conduct business and share in the same society. I mean, so our America is a peculiar place in it that it's had pluralism from its beginning, including religious pluralism. For those of you who were part of the discussion earlier today, many of the positive aspects of spirituality and religion and care in medicine were shared. And I think Professor Iltis just illustrated many of the reasons why we should at least not forget religion and medicine when it comes to morality and bioethics. What I'm going to focus on is probably some of the challenges that a clinician faces in making that granular, making that particular. Some people may be a little confused by now, so I'll have one more disclaimer before I start. How they just heard from a director of a bioethics program, and they're about to hear from another director of a bioethics program, and we're both critical of bioethics. In this, you should realize that there are a couple of ways that bioethics is used in language. Professor Iltis and I both run centers where we engage and grapple with the quandaries and controversies in biomedicine today. But then there are others who push bioethics as a new quasi-religion, a new way of thinking that pretends that there is a secular canonical authority that is bioethics. We resist that, both of us do. Now, there are some secular principles that we think are better than not. I think we would defend many principles around research ethics. We have defend many things in clinical ethics, more procedural ethics that try to show trustworthiness and a lack of fraud or lack of wrongdoing. But it's in those areas of contention, those areas of controversy, that bioethics doesn't have the ability nor the authority to resolve the dilemmas. So I'm going to be focusing on some of those dilemmas in this brief talk. Now, medicine and religion, Professor Iltis rightly showed the continuity of medicine and religion, that Western medicine is in the line of religious medicine. What was Hippocratic medicine had Hippocratic movements within Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, and some movements outside of Hippocratic medicine as well. But the modern medicine is different. Technological medicine is different in many ways, though it has some continuity. Some have argued, like even Illich, that medicine is a rival to the church. If you think about it, we likely live in a post-Christian era, and in the villages and cities of old, the great building bedecked with splendor was the cathedral or the church or the parish for the village. And those who were called upon to be authorities were the priests. Where today, often the largest building that's bedecked with splendor is the local medical center. And those with flowing white robes inside that not only are called upon to be healers for those that are sick, but often are called upon to be a moral authority. If medicine says it's right, then it must be acceptable. You can think of a host of different things. If medicine says that it's the standard of care to change someone's gender, if medicine says marijuana is wholesome and medically appropriate, it changes the idea that the society has on that topic. What may have been illicit in the past, all of a sudden becomes wholesome. We see this in tobacco in the early 20th century. It was medicine that was turned to endorse tobacco in the affirmative in order to advertise it to the masses before, even when health claims were dubious at the time, even then. So there are many accounts of this, I won't belabor it any longer, that medicine is a rival to the church, that it has competing visions. In general, the history that Professor Iltis laid out is spot on. We are in this pluralist society that we live in, we find ourselves. We don't agree on where we come from, where we're going to, and we don't agree on what the good and the valuable is. So we have competing visions of virtue versus vice, good and evil, and right and wrong. And harder for some people to realize, we even have competing visions of what the good life is, what health is, and what death is, especially a good death, and what happens after death, obviously. To think about health, we may come to agreement on the definition of type 1 diabetes mellitus, but we may not come to agreement on what good sexual health is, or what a good psychological health is. These may have religious connotations that are very deep and bring great difference in our society. So some people, when they're coming to a medicine or religion talk, they expect to see something that they're not going to get today, other than this one slide. And that is is the empirical studies that back medicine and religion. That's the studies that say that religion does still matter. For those, I would turn to people like Farr Curlin, who's the first reference listed on conscience and controversial clinical practices, and Tim Pollack, who's the senior author for the second study, The Spiritual and Religious Orientation Impact the Clinical Practice of Healthcare Providers. There's multiple studies in the literature similar to these that give space to prove to, well, the naysayers that religion actually still does matter. Matters not only to our patients, it matters to our clinicians. And to ignore religion is we're doing it to our own folly. The last article I mentioned is I'm one of the authors on, and it was interesting. In the earlier today, there was many people made the comment that it's religion or culture. And what the study that I did with one of my students, Ron Engelhardt, we looked at a data set that showed it's not an either or, it's a yes and. Matter of fact, if you're from a society or an area that's heavily religious, especially if it's one religion, even if you're secular, you're more likely to adopt the moral and ethical values of that religion than if you're a member of that religion that's in a secular society. So the role of religion is still there, and the dichotomy is not culture versus religion, it's often both and, but they do clearly inform each other. So when we think of competing visions of health, some things do come to mind readily. For instance, in abortion, is that part of women's health? Is it really a healthy thing to consider abortion? Obviously, many would say that it can't be healthy to take a life. Others would say giving a woman the ability to choose and live the life she wants brings her health. Others would retort that, is it at what cost, and is it truly health? That maybe that proclamation ignores so much of the lived experience of those that have had abortion. Reproductive technology. Is it reproductive health to engage in vitro fertilization or contraception or other practices that can bring health problems in order to have children on demand and only when it's convenient? There's going to be controversies, and there will be religious basis for these. Then sex and gender issues I've already mentioned. Obviously, there's controversy there. And secular bioethics does not have the ability, nor medicine the authority, to wipe away these controversies. So you may ask, is conscientious practice the answer? And my brief commentary aside on this is perhaps that toleration can prevail, and perhaps toleration in the form of conscientious practice, or sometimes conscientious refusal, is an answer. The challenge with that is that what is being pushed now as tolerance is not a pure tolerance. It's not a tolerance across the board. It's a tolerance similar to that tolerance that was described by the philosopher Herbert Marcuse as a discriminative or repressive tolerance. He actually suggested that be the practice. For Marcuse, the tolerance that is prescribed for society is only the toleration of the new, the toleration of the progressive change that has come. No longer are you to tolerate the intolerable traditional. And thus, thinkers like Marcuse had a way of wanting to squeeze out the traditional or the conservative. Those who wanted to conserve traditional values in the past, once there was a change, that was that new change is the thing to be tolerated. And anyone who rationally could come around in dialogue in that change, they're tolerated. But those that would have especially irrational and religious claims to a traditional value, that view would not be tolerated. And so conscientious practice is under assault in the same way. Bioethicists such as Julian Savulescu, and here in the States, Zeke Emanuel and Romit Stahl have written in major journals like the British Medical Journal and the New England Journal of Medicine that if any physician's not willing to do all things that are legal, then they should be exited from the field. So maybe conscientious practice is an answer to pluralism, but it's definitely under assault in many fields, not just bioethics, but also law. Now at base, I have to tip my hand and say I'm not really for conscientious practice. I wish that what I considered evil wouldn't be allowed in medicine. I wish that I could practice a medicine that wouldn't kill, But that's a radical idea now. But so ideally, if I were in charge of things, I probably wouldn't allow the conscientious practice of doctors delivering death. But I've been outvoted. So just like most of you, if you're really honest, we really don't want plurality. We don't want conscientious practice or religious liberty. We really want people to agree with us. It's just when we're faced with that kind of hard truth and that we observe, most people don't agree with us, which I'm reminded of this all the time, that we then want to argue for liberty so that we don't have our liberty taken away. And that's my default position on conscientious practice. In theory, I'm not for it because I want a better medicine. I want a medicine that doesn't participate in what I clearly know is evil. But since the evil is among us, I'd rather have the liberty to practice as I choose, so I'll defend conscientious practice. In some strange way, I almost agree with Marcusa, but we just disagree wildly on what the good and the true and the beautiful are. So another answer on competing visions of health could be that we should have religious and cultural competence. And this is often a funny quip when you talk about spirituality and medicine, that religious or cultural competence is probably not achievable. It's an aspiration that can never be met. Most people that aren't competent in their own religion, in their own culture, and becoming competent in other religions and other cultures is not realistic. But at least I think we can heed that it's been argued that the United States of America is one of the most religious countries in the history of the world. Yet we're one of the most religiously illiterate countries in the world. So at least becoming more literate in religious issues and religions is helpful. So, but I think becoming competent is not. So maybe having respect is an answer. And even respect may be asking too much in some ways. At the Center for Bioethics at The Ohio State, we have a diverse group of faculty and students and others engaging in discussions on controversy. And we have very upfront and explicit guidelines on how things are going to be conducted. We're going to dialogue with respect, even when we don't respect the position, the philosophy, the religion, or even the person. Now, I hope it's pretty easy for me to respect some persons, but I may not respect their position. So asking for respect, well, maybe it's enough to be respectful and to care about the person in some way, in a respectful way. So now I'm going to get to stories. And then with the final example, I'll have several stories. So hopefully we have time to go through them. So the first example I'll illustrate just to get at religion in medicine is when I go to hospice and palliative medicine conferences, it is very, very common that that there will be a special session on the problem family. And usually it's an African-American family who is refusing to take their loved one off aggressive medical interventions in the ICU, and perhaps because they're waiting for a miracle. So my response, I go to these sessions regularly and I say, why is this a problem family? I actually welcome this kind of family, a family that is trying to be faithful and obedient, to be loving, to be present. Why is this a problem? And it's probably because they don't follow the normal push of withdrawal that others follow. Now, I also feel comfortable engaging with that family and kind of talking around religion and faith and hopes. I have a comfort that other people may not be comfortable with. So other healthcare providers may be less comfortable talking to such a family, but I welcome this family. I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a great blessing, the families there, in trying to be faithful and obedient. And I usually tell them that very early. And talking about their hopes and their aspirations. A couple of things that I'll mention but I'll try to be brief. One is often this question of miracle, and what do we do with miracle? And I usually ask permission to engage it. Now, I'll say as a caveat, I'm somewhat unusual in that most of my patients very quickly know that I'm an Eastern Orthodox Christian. They know other things about me. And while we're on that, I'll just give an aside. Someone in the earlier sessions asked, is it ethical for a physician to share their beliefs? I think we're engaging in a relationship where I think it's problematic for physicians to always stay behind a facade of the objective scientist. It's akin to kind of scientific voyeurism, that we ask patients all kinds of things about themselves. And because so much medicine is informed by the academy and the large medical center, we don't get the joy of taking care of our neighbors, our friends, our family. There's problems with family, but taking care of them. There's other problems with family too, but that's beside the point. But to dare to actually enter into relationship with patients, I think is allowable. There's obviously limits to that, but so many people think you have to be this objective scientist. And I think this is very problematic. So my patients in my palliative medicine practice often know that I had a major injury a few years ago where I broke my neck and I was on pain medicine, and I share some of the experience I had around that. They may know my grandfather's decision to choose hospice. They may know struggles that other members of my family have had. They may hear about me caring for my father in our own home as he died. I don't think any of that's problematic unless I use it for manipulative or coercive intent. But what I'm doing is trying to normalize things to make my family or my patient feel like and know that they're not the only person that's ever dealt with this. So I tell stories with families and with patients in order to normalize things, to start a dialogue so I can listen to them and they can share and feel more open in sharing. So back to this family, I can ask if they're comfortable. I can say, I'm a Christian. I believe in miracle too. And can we talk about that? And with permission, we can slowly share our hopes, our thoughts. We can confess that Lazarus was raised from the dead. But I also can remind kindly that Lazarus isn't walking with us now, not in the body, that he did die. That the same God who raised Lazarus from the dead was also pleased for mystical reasons to take his life, his body life. So the sharing that with a family longing for miracle, not only I'm not using it to build trust, but to bring greater understanding when it's possible. So that's one way that I've dealt with that kind of quandary. So let's just think from a bioethics standpoint, what of the 4 principles? Professor Iltis rightly said that they're challenging. I mean, they are not self-evident. They come from research ethics. And in my clinical ethics training, I tell students and trainees and physicians that the 4 principles at the bedside, I don't think are very helpful. If you think of the Tuskegee syphilis trial that Professor Iltis mentioned, clearly autonomy was violated. The research subjects did not have consent. Beneficence, the trial was not for their good, it was for the good of science, quote unquote. Non-maleficence, it did harm. It kept the research subjects away from a good treatment. Injustice, no, I mean, if you were a white man in Birmingham, Alabama, you would have gotten treated. If you were a black man in Birmingham, Alabama, you would have gotten treated. If you were a black man in Tuskegee and weren't in the trial, you may have been treated. That's a harder point. So the 4 principles were helpful in research ethics, but at the bedside, with a family who's wanting aggressive measures, and the team is saying, no, we're not going to bring your loved one to recovery. We should stop. Well, autonomy. Okay, well, what's the patient want? Well, the patient's not able to talk to us. We could use substituted judgment, best interest, but we know from research studies, those are very inexact. They're an idea, really a legal idea that came into clinical ethics, but they're good. They're a good guide. They're kind of the best we have, but autonomy is really aspirational. It's not, it's hard, it's elusive in this kind of case. Beneficence, to do good. Well, the family would say, it's good to keep my mother alive. The ICU nurse may say, well, it'd be good for us to allow this woman to die, since we can't heal her. And non-maleficence, doing harm. The family may say, what's more harmful than death? And the bedside nurse may say, I keep having to poke and prod and treat her, which I'm willing to do if I could bring someone to recovery, but without recovery, it's just a burden that she shouldn't be put through. So we can't agree on what the good and the harm is. And then the justice is elusive as well. So generally these cases, I don't think are, can be resolved with the 4 principles or through a simple secular ethics mechanism. So what do you do? Well, it's pretty mundane. In that I think you do engage these families with as much love as you can give, with caring, communication, education, trying to connect them to their faith community wherever they are. But unlike me 20 years ago, where I would have tried to resolve the dilemma, now I'm far more comfortable with it being unresolved, doing the best we can in a messy situation, even though the medical team may not get their way and what the family wants may seem unreasonable to many. I'm comfortable with it being unresolved. Example 2. Excuse me for my voice. Problems such as euthanasia or assisted suicide, or physician aid in dying, which I despise that term. It makes it sound like people that are caring for the dying are, it's equivocating that with assisted suicide and voluntary active euthanasia. So here I'm talking about all the above. Can secular bioethics or resolve this dilemma? Well, no, it can't. Why can't it? Well, some people will choose to try to make a very rational argument as to why euthanasia or assisted suicide and the like ought be illicit. That you can make all kinds of arguments. For instance, the argument that if we move to euthanasia, that patients will not be cared for as well, we'll neglect them in their end of life care, and what they need is good palliative care and not hastening death. There's a host of rational defenses I won't belabor, but I don't find any of them all that compelling. When at Ohio State, I was once in a debate with Dr. Timothy Quill, who's famous for the Quill versus Vaco. He's a physician and an activist for assisted suicide and euthanasia. And I've known Dr. Quill for a long time. He's always been very kind to me. We disagree profoundly on this issue. And he gave a very rational defense for euthanasia. And it went something, this is my words, not his, that medicine has a duty to relieve suffering. Of course, that's challengeable. Why does medicine have a duty to relieve suffering? Medicine has a duty to care for the sick, but relieve suffering may be a little Quixote-esque. I mean, it may be too high of a bar to mix my metaphor. So he may say that something like medicine has a duty to relieve suffering. He may even say when it can. And that some fates are worse than death, that some suffering, we should eliminate suffering, even if it means eliminating the sufferer. Okay, well, if suffering is the greatest evil, then that makes rational sense. But if sin, death, and the devil are a greater evil, then it doesn't make sense. So my response in our debate was, I just said, for God's sake, stop. That it is a religious question whether we should take life or not. From a secular point of view, two people coming from competing axiologies or understanding of value, we're not going to come to agreement on rational standards for whether euthanasia is right or wrong. And I've talked to Dr. Quill enough to know that I'm not going to be able to convince him with rational argument, but I'm not saying he's unreasonable. A very bright man, very rational. I just think he's wrong. And the reason I think he's wrong is my understanding of what God says and what God commands. And those are claims that Dr. Quill would reject. It doesn't make his claim valid and mine invalid. I would actually say my claims are valid and his are not, though his are rational. So this point is only to illustrate that the rivalry between religion and medicine and medical ethics is not always one that can bring resolution. Similarly and quickly, palliative sedation, I bring up. Palliative sedation, when we talk about this ethical controversy, the definition really does matter. So some people will say palliative sedation even when someone's dying sleepy. Well, that's not sedation. Most patients with many different illnesses, most patients will actually die sleepy with or without medicines. So palliative sedation, for the term that I think is ethically controversial, is actually intentional sedation to a level of near or unconsciousness intentionally until someone dies. Okay. Or it could be that you're using medicines heavy-handedly so that someone is sedated. Again, that's intentional sedated to unconsciousness or near unconsciousness until someone dies. So the definition matters on what we're talking about. Several studies don't use it with that precise of a definition. So if you ask an audience of 200 people or 500 people how they'd like to die, in America, most of them are going to say, well, what would you say? Maybe I'd like to die in my sleep. I'd like to die painless, suddenly in my sleep. So it's not a great surprise that American medicine would turn to sedating people as they die. But in a religious context, there are many faiths that very much value being awake as possible. Like I said, many people, most people that are dying are asleep in some way or delirious in some way. So having some wakefulness is important to many religions, to many people of faith, and important in many religions. And so you have these very diametrically opposed visions of the good death. One may say sedating intentionally and having someone who looks still, almost lifeless, is better, and that's a good death, compared to someone who may have more symptoms and may be awake and more aware. And of course, the whole gradient of how much medicine to use at the end of life to help relieve symptoms is there as well. Many faiths will, they may say you can relieve symptoms to some extent, but one is an option. Is someone necessarily crazy if they say, no, I don't want the medicine? I don't want it. I want to experience the process. That was the way most of history was, even though St. Basil the Great even talked about using opium for the care of the dying. It's been allowed, but it has been mandated. And many have said throughout history, have warned against the overuse of sedatives, that we should be aware as we approach death. So medicine and or many religious views aren't going to agree on this point with the dominant movement of the modern palliative movement. Even though I'm in the dominant palliative movement, I think there's much good there. There are some dangers as well. This consideration gets at the broader question of suffering. Does suffering have a purpose? My simple response to a very deep question is it may. And I'll answer that by telling a story. When I broke my neck, I was thrown from a horse and I broke my neck at C5. And I broke several other bones, ribs and clavicle, and dropped my right lung, and was very sick for several months. Pain medicine didn't work very well for me at all. I tried it, I got off of it pretty quickly, was on pretty big doses, got off very quickly over a couple of weeks because it just didn't work. And I was immobile. I'm usually a very active person. I couldn't read, couldn't think very clearly because of the brain injury. And I would say, I mean, I've had many patients that have suffered far more than I did. But God gave me suffering, I guess, that he knew I could handle. But within that suffering, I found great gratitude for it. It brought a clarity, even though I couldn't read or think like I wanted to, at least early on. There was a simplicity and a reliance, a faith that pervaded. The grace was tangible. The repentance was deep. And oddly, I long for that time sometimes, even now that I'm healthy, because that clarity and that richness of repentance, I'm often missing at other times. So I can say personally, suffering can have a great meaning. It can be life-changing, can be reorienting to the things that are important. Now, I'm not saying that palliative medicine should be rejected or that opioids should never be used. No, quite the contrary. I still practice it and I prescribe those medicines every week. But I do think giving meaning in suffering is something that medicine has lost. Instead, suffering has become the great enemy that has to be annihilated, even if it means ending the sufferer. And I think that's a great overstep. And it's missing the potential healing that suffering can bring as well. Somewhere in between those extremes, I think, is that royal path that we should go down as medicine. Now for my fourth example that I'll linger on for a little longer and for the remainder of our time. And that is palliative medicine that I practice. And just to give context, I've cared for over 6,000 patients with terminal illness. I mainly do outpatient palliative medicine now, mainly seeing advanced breast cancer patients. But palliative medicine tries to and claims to practice a biopsychosocial spiritual model. And the hyphen is there on purpose. And because it really is a gradient. We do a lot more bio than we do psycho. We do more psycho than social, because how to change someone's social circumstance is very, very difficult. But then the spiritual is something we want to learn about. We want to know the basic FICA questions. You know, what is your faith and how is it important to you? What's your community? All those things. It's important to know our patient. And like I said before, I share of myself, not in a proselytizing way, although as an aside, many people are quick to say there's no proselytizing, but I'll challenge you. Look around your own medical center, your hospital. Are you proselytizing New Age Hinduism, New Age Buddhism with yoga lessons everywhere and mindfulness meditation? You can say and make a claim that it's secularized, but I'm telling you, if you ask a traditional Buddhist, they may say something otherwise, that to secularize those postures, to secularize the pattern of mindfulness, you're still doing a religious practice. And I think it's actually proselytized at many major medical centers now. Why it gets a free pass is, well, that's a deeper mystery, I guess. Anyway, we do attempt to practice biopsychosocial spiritual medicine, but the spiritual is difficult to get at. So many will focus on spiritual assessments, and chaplaincy is unfortunately having to kind of prove their need to exist by doing spiritual assessments and even worse, spiritual outcome measures. Please don't make chaplains do this. They should exist because they're good in and of itself. To have to do spiritual assessments and outcome measures puts them in this cycle of kind of a medical model of spiritual care that I think can be very dangerous. So the problem with the spiritual assessment is, what spirit is it of? What spirit, where's the spirit come from? Where's it going to and for what purpose? It doesn't have to be the ecumenical spirit. Can it be a specific one? And how do you assess it if it's not one that you share? So to illustrate the point, one of the easiest spiritual assessments could be asking, are you at peace with God? Well, what does peace mean? And for a lot of our patients, who is God? What do you mean by that? Is there a God or is there not? And if there is, who? Is it the same? We may use similar language, but is it the same God really? And what does peace mean? Does peace mean happiness? Shalom? Does it mean something else? In some places, I mean, to further make it, to make it more personal, I'll often hear from a patient, I know I'm going to a better place. So I have patients, over the years, for some reason, now I get patients sent to me who don't have any symptom problems, they're not ready for hospice, they're not transitioning in any way. There's no goals of care conversation, it's all been had, but they're being sent to me because they want to talk about facing death. And I don't know why I get those patients now, but for some reason I get sent those patients now. And so we get into this conversation of what they're afraid of. Now, I have a later slide on that and more depth. And many times they will volunteer, I know I'm going to a better place. And there's a conflict here with my own faith. It's very common in especially Protestant Christianity to have assurance of salvation. And but in my observation, that comment of I know I'm going to a better place is fairly ubiquitous throughout the American culture. It's not just Protestant Christianity. And it does set itself against my own faith in that we don't offer assurance of salvation. We offer assurance that Christ is salvation, but we never take for granted that we're saved. And we don't give assurance of damnation either. I'm not going to assure you that you're damned. Well, why does this why is this important? I would not view a good death as someone saying, I know I'm going to a better place and having confidence. Instead, I mean, for an Orthodox Christian, the good death is one who's humble and praying the prayer of the publican, God have mercy on me, a sinner. That, to go to that granular level in a spiritual assessment in healthcare would be a radical departure from the norm. And it's a great challenge, not only for chaplains, but all clinicians of faith, how to intersect between competing understandings of what the right spirit is to have as someone's approaching death. So what do I do with patients? How do I try to get at this? I usually talk to them about the one I normalize quite often, that patients, in my experience, often have problems sleeping. They have thoughts that are going through their head when they sleep, and it's hard for them to get rid of them. The other thing I point out is that many patients come to me saying they're anxious. And I tell them, I ask them, Did you have anxiety problems before you had terminal cancer? And they say, no. And I say, well, you're not anxious. If I had a bear chasing me, I wouldn't say I'm anxious for the bear. I would say I'm afraid and I'm scared. And a lot of times those are those thoughts that when you distract yourself from the day, you lay down, you start thinking, those are the thoughts that come, those fears. And I encourage them to keep a log next to their bed. Not, they can journal if they want, I don't care about that. I just want them to think, to write down some of those fears. And we talk about what kind of categories they can fall into. And we do that so that they can do something about it, right? So if they're transactional fears, these may be the, who takes care of my dogs if I'm gone or if I get sick, or do I have a last will and testament? Do I have a living will? Do I have a durable power of attorney? Those kinds of things, those advanced care planning documents and related things, taking care of some of the social situation, those transactional things, some people will really put off for a long time. And there's no reason we can take care of them early as possible. The next category is the relational business. That is the people that come to mind. Is it your niece that you want to say thank you because of the kind word that was given, or someone that you need to tell them that you love them, or that you're sorry, or just calling them because they came to mind and saying, I'm thinking of you. That I've learned over my years to listen to that voice. If someone comes to mind, call them, contact them. Don't hesitate. Many people, especially when they've been given a terminal diagnosis, have this idea of the kumbaya moment around the deathbed, where they can pass on wisdom and blessing and have great movie music playing in the background. I've seen that happen a few times, even in real life, not just movies. But I ask them, why wait? For many, that doesn't come. So to deal with the relational aspects early, I've never known anyone offended because they were contacted. And I've never had a patient that regretted contacting someone early rather than later. And once we are able to deal with some of those fears, we create the ability to deal with the spiritual, the transcendent, existential, for some that don't like that word. I don't say they're the same. It's just, that's the way I can get to it. And what do I do with the spiritual? Well, I'll get to that more in one of the cases to follow. So some of my cases that I'm going to try to get through in our final minutes.
Professor Nash, I just wanted to step in and say we'll probably have to pivot here really quickly if you want to bring a final point, so we can go to Q&A.
I got it.
Yep.
So I'll skip the first one. The first one is basically a patient who most of her problems are all around who's going to take care of her dogs. That's that transactional business that can be taken, that can be taken care of. The next point was, I'll actually skip, is a patient who didn't want her mother knowing her terminal diagnosis. And she actually said there would be curses upon me if I told her. And through various ways, if we have time in the Q&A, I can tell that story. Then dealing with grief is a patient that the person that was coming to mind was someone who had already died. It was someone he had wronged, and he felt great guilt that he couldn't say I'm sorry to that person before he died. And for that person, because he was Christian, he gave me permission to enter into a space with him. I prescribed Psalm 50 according to the Septuagint numbering. So have mercy, my God, according to thy great mercy. That psalm, where it says, against thee only have I sinned. So this is King David, who has killed Uriah and committed adultery with Bathsheba, is saying, against thee, O God, have I sinned, alone. And sharing that story with him and prescribing that as a daily psalm to be read is something where you could have this tangible interaction with religion and medicine. Then to illustrate the point that I left the last slide on, I had a friend, an oncologist, come to me, and she didn't have any pain. She didn't have any other symptoms. Her question was, I'm really struggling with facing death. And I've heard you talk, and I just want your advice. But she's Hindu. So what do I say? How do I respectfully do this? Well, I take a history. I listen to her. I go through those same transactional and relational issues. I give some advice on other things that she had direct questions on. And then when it comes to the spiritual, I say, well, I'm an Orthodox Christian. I can tell you what that may look like for me a little bit. And I share about this much, not in depth, just about this much. And then, but I tell her, I think the struggle of grappling with the spiritual aspect is worthy, regardless of what path you've gone down. I can't say that all paths are equal. I can't say all paths are good or true, but I think the struggle is worthy. And that I'm happy to talk and listen to her as she goes down that path. But also connecting, if she connects to her religious community, that's how many people go down that path.
With that, Dr. Nash, we thank you.
Yeah.
And I think we need time now to move to our questions and answer period.
Yes, thank you.
Lots of questions, and I know we're not going to have time to do it all, but and what's interesting is the question seems to be dividing between practitioners who are having practical concerns and then some philosophers who want to discuss the philosophical part of it. But I want to turn to Professor Iltis for the first question. I think you've made a wonderful case, the importance about dialogue and not just assuming that there is a general ethics that works in all cases. The question that came up is, what is the goal of entering into dialogue with these patients? What is the goal? How do you identify that goal?
I think it's a great question. I think it'll certainly depend to an extent on the context and the case. So some of the cases that we looked at earlier this afternoon, for those of you who were able to participate in the program this afternoon, were cases about patients refusing medical treatment based on or purportedly based on religious commitments. And in some of those cases, it became important to enter into a dialogue to understand whether the patient truly understood the information, whether the patient might actually be seeking additional religious guidance from a trusted leader to interpret it, or whether it was simply a matter of, yes, this patient understands the information, has a deep commitment, and it's one I don't share, but I have to respect it. So sometimes the reasons I think are different. In the long run, and in sort of the bigger picture that I was talking about, I think part of the answer has to be that there are many times where each of us has a particular view of the good, of what is valuable, and it is not a view that everybody shares. Not everyone has that same set of commitments. And if medicine physicians and other clinicians have professed that they seek to promote the good of the patient and respect patients, surely patients have a role in defining what is good for them and understanding overall what is good for them. There may be the idea that medical indication is kind of all there is to understanding the good of the patient, I think is inaccurate. And so to understand, to respect, and to promote what a patient understands as their overall goal. There was a time when the push was in the other direction, right? People were so concerned that medicine was pushing so hard to do so much, and families and patients were saying we want to do less. I think now we often hear of the cases are the opposite direction, where families are seen as demanding too much or patients wanting too much. But in all of these cases, the patient helps to define the good.
Good. I want to follow up with you, not on this question, but on another aspect. And that is, we not only have practitioners and philosophers in our viewing audience here, but we also have students. And the question is, how can medical students learn some of the principles that you're dealing with? You're dealing with a very sensitive issue of how to balance out your own beliefs and your both of the speakers are kind of rejecting that there does exist a secular or a rational bioethics principle. These are really subtle issues. How do you get students to understand that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there very clearly are secular ethical guidelines that are to be followed, and that practitioners of various sorts of health practitioners are expected to follow. I think one of the challenges comes in interpreting and applying them. So this idea of respecting a patient's autonomy, for example, what people mean by that and how they understand it and where they think the limits are, that's largely where we get into great conflict. So in terms of students, I think watch and listen, humility, learning from people, listening to people. One of the things I think is so powerful and that I really have come to appreciate more in recent years than I did earlier in my career is the power of narrative, of listening to people, reading. One of the hats I wear is I'm co-editor of a journal called Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics, which is published by Hopkins. It's available online through a lot of medical school and university libraries. And we collect stories on particular themes in bioethics. And I have learned so much from reading patient accounts of what their experiences were, things that many people would not have assumed were the most important thing for the patient. So I think listening, watching, being humble, being willing to be surprised, being willing to give people the benefit of the doubt and expect that there might be another version of the story. You know, the case I gave of Tia and Blossom, I think, was an example of that. I mean, people were stunned. They couldn't believe that the thing they were accusing these women of, they said, it's not an accusation. Of course that's true, right? That their world, that their experience was so different. So there's so much to learn from the people that you're serving or that you hope to serve.
Thank you. I'll just reflect in terms of my own work and the interfaith. A lot of what we have to do is very similar to what I think you're describing. We have to listen to others. We may not agree with them. In fact, we don't ask for consensus. We really ask for understanding. And a key to that understanding is narrative. Religious traditions are carried by narrative, not by basic principles. When you get underneath the various narratives, there are some similarities in values between the religions, but those values are carried through narrative, and narrative is a wonderful way to do that. To further ask the question, in terms of the practitioner, especially now during COVID when family can't be there, and even in some cases chaplains aren't available. It sounds like both of you, out of your faith, are willing to address some of those issues, but where's the line? What's appropriate in terms of sharing your faith in dealing with a person who doesn't have their own faith community present, especially now given the restrictions?
Well, I think
I'm not in a position. I mean, I'll just say I'm not a clinician, so I don't know that I'm not really in a position to answer that in the same way.
Okay, Dr. Nash.
Yeah, I think one, you do things with permission. That's important. In medicine, permission gives us the ability to do all kinds of things. That permission needs to be genuine. If I am talking to my patient, they need to know that my care of them is not going to be, I'm not going to abandon them if they say something that will offend me or disagree me in some way. But to engage with them at a personal level, one, I would say that if you're proselytizing in such a way that you're trying to get an outcome more than you're trying to listen and be with the person, then something's wrong. Proselytizing in such a way that you're trying to get someone to make a quick decision or something is I think most people rightfully say that's wrong. But sharing of yourself and entering in a relationship, I think, is allowable. So what limits? One, it shouldn't be manipulative. It shouldn't be coercive. It shouldn't be pushed upon someone, but sharing of yourself can be done. I think I encourage trainees that if they're going to do this, they should be aware of the power dynamic between clinician and patient, that there's even an unsaid power dynamic. You should be humble in doing such things. There are exceptions. I've engaged in a great deal of depth. So I especially thinking around COVID, around the lonely person, being present and sharing of your faith and listening to someone else's faith would be a great benefit, a great blessing to many people. I have had challenges in my own career. One of the cases that I didn't get to was a 28-year-old, I'm changing the details to protect privacy, but a 28-year-old woman who was pregnant and had 2 children, and she had an operable tumor. And she was saying that, and she was a traditional Roman Catholic, and she was saying she did not want treatment. She didn't want surgery, even though it was a curable tumor. And I wanted to make her, to disqualify her as incapacitated, but I couldn't. She was rational. And I turned to her husband trying to help me, and her husband agreed with her. And her parents happened to be there, and they agreed with her. And this was a pregnant mom of 2 with 1 on the way. And she had an operable tumor. With treatment, she probably, I mean, she had a normal life expectancy. The tumor may recur, but it could be treated again. She probably had a life expectancy of 2 to 6 weeks. It was an emergency. And I couldn't understand. So I asked if she had asked the blessing of a priest, and she said yes, she had called before the visit and he blessed her refusing. And my Texas urge was to go beat the priest, but I didn't. Instead, I did engage with permission. I wanted to know why. I really wanted to know why. And that was about a 2.5-hour office visit where the patient and the husband and her parents, with permission, we kind of sat down and did almost did a Christian ethics inquiry. So now I was trying to convince her that she was wrong. I was trying, but I wasn't coercive and I wasn't manipulative. I really was listening, but that was the most aggressive that I've ever been in trying to persuade someone of a religious claim. And that persuasion comes because we were closer. I think I'd have a harder time persuading someone with a faith that would be so much different than mine. But I think the closer you are in faith, the more you can align and have that religious conversation. Hope that helps.
I think, let me turn back to a philosophical question now. We've had a clinical, let's get back to the philosophy. If our ethics needs a moral base, and I think you're implying, Anna, that it actually needs a religious moral base, how do we deal then with the increasing diversity of religious of our population? It's more and more diverse, where there is no common. How do you struggle with those in which you don't find that commonality right away?
I think any time that we make a normative claim, we ought to do this or we ought not to do that, we're making a claim that is grounded at some level in some value judgment, moral judgment. You can call it whatever you want to call it, right? It's not just, it's never just a pure thrown out of the sky objective reason kind of claim, because you can say, I gave the example of kidney allocation. I can say, this is the allocation that will maximize the number of life years saved, right? Somebody could say that overall. And somebody else's response might be, who cares, right? You have to go from here are the data to here's what we ought to do about it. You require value judgments or moral judgments or whatever you want to call them. And for many people, those judgments are informed by religion. For many, they're not. And that is part of what I think is so important, is that we cannot lose sight of the fact that, first of all, what are sometimes presented as secular judgments that are simply reasonable and that all reasonable people should recognize, which makes it really hard to understand why someone would refuse treatment, for example, in many cases. those are also normative or value judgments. They're moral judgments. And we need to recognize that we're all making those judgments, whether they're based on religion or something else. So I think that's the first piece, is it's always there. And to single religion out and say, but if your beliefs are religious, then it's a problem, is problematic. In terms of across the board, the reality, right? This is what leads us to need to know, how do we interact when we disagree? What kinds of agreements do we come to say we have different views? How will we move forward? In what ways will we interact? In what ways will we not interact? And this may in some cases require disclosures and disclaimers on the part of both patients and clinicians. I mean, there's all different kinds of circumstances, but the reality is we're not going to make that pluralism go away. And so learning to engage appropriately and respectfully sometimes means we have to recognize that we will not agree. We will have to face really serious questions about what may I force someone else to do on my behalf, for example. And this gets at the issue of conscientious refusal that Dr. Nash was talking about. I may not force a patient to do something, but a patient may not force me. And so we need to have really serious discussions about what it means to live respectfully in a diverse and pluralistic society. If we've agreed that we're not going to use force to make each other do things, right? If we've agreed we're not going to be Texans all, then we have to decide how are we going to do that.
Yeah, there's actually the question that you had was, I mean, there's some types of ethics that it's a very thin foundation. I mean, it's just operationalized in law and in hospital policy and professional standards. It's not foundational. It's just saying if we're going to live in peace, then we seek permission, we seek consent. And that's very modest, but I mean, wow, what a statement, right? To actually get permission and to have things like informed consent. So the ethics that is agreed upon in clinical ethics may be very modest, may be very thin, but it's significant nonetheless, and especially when you add the local professional standards and state laws, et cetera, that help guide, you have quite a nice content there. It's not content rich, it's very content thin, but you do have a basis. So for students, I would say learn that basic procedural ethics for sure. Then students have this wonderful advantage of having time with patients where they can learn their patients. They can learn about them, they can ask questions, they can really go into depth and learn what they're thinking, not just what the disease process is, but take advantage of dealing with patients and the complexities of what they hope for and what they think. So that's the only thing I did.
I just want to add one thing to this, and that is that the challenge that I think I am certainly responding to, that I think Dr. Nash also kind of was addressing to some extent, is that clinical ethics of what he's referred to as a procedural ethics is in fact thin. It's not without any moral content. It has content, but it's thin. What we're seeing today, though, in bioethics is kind of an ever expanding pool of things that are supposedly part of that content. And it's truly become the case that many, many, many things are now said to be simply part of that ethic, rather than that is a thin set of agreements that we follow. And so the kind of expansion of that into ever more substantive things is particularly, I think, problematic, because often what is lost in that is respect for at least some religious views.
Let's come back to the practitioner question. And this has come up in various forms in a number of the questions. Most people operate in a system, and that system has a authority structure. What happens when the employer has certain things that they're asking the practitioner to follow or not to do, and yet the practitioner feels a strong need to have this I-thou relationship, if you will, this more meaningful relationship? how do you balance that question between the employee who feels pressure from the employer?
Well, I think it depends on role, right? If your radiation technologist feels like they have to do a full spiritual assessment every time they go into a room, maybe they should change training and do chaplaincy. So I think there's some things that would be appropriate based on role and some things that aren't. I mean, I'm a palliative care doctor. Spirituality comes up. I mean, if I don't do a spiritual assessment, I'm not doing a good history, right? If I'm doing colonoscopies, that's probably not needed. So again, I think it's role dependent. I was the chief medical officer for a county health system. And if I had people asking strange questions out of place, I would have challenged that as well. So then you have, if you're dealing in a secular system that says you can't have any religious language, I would challenge them with the studies that of the type that I mentioned briefly in my talk, which is that actually a lot of patients do want that to be addressed by their healthcare team. Others don't. It's not 100% of even people that are religious people. They're not all saying, please engage me. I'm one of those people. I'm a person of faith, but if my nurse wants to talk to me about faith, I'll talk, but I don't want your advice. And if when I was sick, I surely didn't want to talk that much. I wanted my wife there, and I wanted my priest to come. So it depends on the circumstance. It depends on the permission. If you are a healthcare professional that wants to have the liberty, you feel constrained that you can't speak on matters of religion because of a direct report or someone in administration telling you can't, I would have a dialogue with chaplaincy and with those administrators on the data that clearly show that a lot of patients do want that engaged by their healthcare team.
That's an opportunity for discussion that a lot of employees don't really have, but I get your point.
Right. Well, there's the Texas approach that you could just nullify and do it anyway. Yeah.
And take your chances. Well, I think the issue is even more apparent now because of these restrictions in the hospitals for having outsiders to come in. And I think that puts even more pressure on the practitioner who wants to have that more personal relationship, wants to treat that person as a thou and the I thou understanding. But there are financial pressures, and there's also on one side and on the other side, there's the absence of the chaplain and the family and the faith community, their ability to be there. So any advice on that for either one of you?
Well, I think it's all the more reason to engage it. I mean, like I said before, healthcare professionals can be a real blessing for people that are alone. When I was in the hospital, I can't imagine being in the hospital without my wife at my side. And with in our system, I've been advocating for patients and visitation that is responsible for a while. I mean, from the beginning, because at the beginning of the COVID crisis, it was all about the lack of PPE. And now the PPE problem is not as severe as it was. So now it's all about infection and transmissibility, and the idea that family members won't follow PPE restrictions. I think that that's not as solid. There was really solid visitation restrictions under shortage of PPE. Now the visitation restrictions they're maybe reasonable, but we're getting on less solid ground when we're talking about you don't think family members can use PPE appropriately if they're trained, and you want to decrease transmission, even though we're not seeing a lot of transmission when PPE is used correctly in healthcare setting. So one, I'd say they could advocate for patients to actually have family and clergy. Definitely. Clergy are allowed in our hospital and have been throughout, for certain types of patients. But then I think that they can be empowered to get to know their patients. In some ways, I don't want to think that religion has to be this box we set over on the shelf, that I'm going to do everything with my patient except, this thing. It's the elephant in the room when you're faced with patients that are facing their finitude. there is this God question, and if a patient wants to engage in that, I think we can have a discussion, a respectful discussion. Some health professionals won't feel comfortable doing that at all. Some may say things that I think would be horrible or bonkers, but I know some people disagree with me. But I think we can, as we relate to one another, we can one another. We can engage the things that are most needful. So again, I think that people should be. I don't think you have to ask for specific permission from an administrator to say, may I talk about religion? I think you can just, as you're getting to know your patient and having a conversation, one human to another, you can talk about the things that you care about. So I would de-emphasize it.
I've gotten a number of questions recognizing that this is a predominantly Christian community, and you will both are coming from a Christian ethics or Christian morality base. There's concern about are we really being respectful of those of other religions? One person said to Dr. Nash, when you're speaking to a patient, do you do research on their religion before you get into that discussion?
Yeah, in general, yeah. I've taught courses on spirituality and medicine and religion and medicine, so I have a working knowledge. So in my case where I had a patient that was Hindu, I listened to her. I don't try to educate her on Hinduism. I ask what that path looks like for her and if she has questions for me. And sometimes those discussions are very superficial. So a lot of patients don't want to engage in that, and I'm okay with that. I'm not looking. The last case that I didn't get to illustrates this a little bit. So a lot of my nurses always knew some of my teaching, and that I felt very comfortable engaging in spiritual questions, religious questions, but I was mainly dealing with people that weren't Orthodox Christians, not Eastern Orthodox Christians. But a lot of the patients enjoyed. I mean, they felt there was something healing about that conversation. There was something that they felt was beneficial. So one day I had a Orthodox Christian on my list. It was one I didn't know from the community, and my nurses were like, "Oh, she's an Orthodox Christian. Oh, you get to engage a discussion with a moral friend, someone who agrees with you, can get in this great discussion." And she spoke English. And she came in and she just said, "Doc, I just need a little bit of pain medicine." I'm like, "Well, we can talk about these." "No, Doc, I just need a little pain medicine." I mean, the bottom line there was she has a priest and she didn't need me to talk about spirituality. She had her community. All I needed to know that was important to her and that she was taken care of. She didn't have any questions for me. So it's not something that's forced. And I had a more in-depth discussion with my Hindu patient than I did my Orthodox Christian patient, only because the Hindu patient was asking me questions. If I don't share anything unless asked. I ask questions about the patient, but about me, I get permission if I'm going to tell a story, or they ask. I usually have a very casual conversation style with patients, and they feel comfortable early. I hope that helps. In no way do I always share my bias, right? I always share that I am an Orthodox Christian. And I may share something about myself, but I recognize that they may not share that experience. Just like I would say, with my father, we decided to do this, but this is a different circumstance. Sharing of yourself, again, like I said briefly, is partly to normalize and open a dialogue and trust for communication. It may get at some truth too along the way.
Yeah.
I'd like to go ahead. Yes, please.
So I think ultimately, from my perspective, the focus has to be on the patient and what the patient understands and needs, right? And so for a patient who has no faith and says, "I don't want to hear you talk about that stuff," that needs to be fine, right? And chances are good that if it starts to come up, you should watch the body language that says, "Ugh, stop," right? The same as when I'm resisting something that I'm like, look, I'm not doing that. I already know what I need to know. We're not going there, right? So I think part of respect is saying, what am I ultimately trying to do? And what I am ultimately trying to do is help promote the patient's interest and the patient's good. And the patient is a critical partner in defining that, right? So, and for patients of different faiths, I think somebody who is of a faith and really takes it seriously, and somebody who is of no faith, both can recognize, for this patient, this matters. The appropriate question is something like, who do you need? What do you need from us? What do you need from the setup that we have here, right? And the same would be true for a patient of no faith, right? Doesn't mean they don't have any needs, right? Who do you need? What do you need? What questions do you have? And for a patient of faith, if the person empowered to ask those questions doesn't ask them because they don't recognize that they might even be important, that's a real problem. So I think the examples here certainly have largely been of Christian examples, especially from Dr. Nash, but I think that the idea is that this is what you do because we take the patient's faith seriously. We don't have to share it, but the question is, what can we do for you? What do you need? What does that mean for you? And that is, to me, a form of respect, of creating the space. One of the real problems I think we have today is that in many cases, people do not want to create that space, especially when it challenges the kind of standard.
Let me follow up, Dr. Iltis. We've talked about the patients in the clinical setting. You're in an academic setting. I don't know, do you teach undergraduate as well as graduate? Tell us a little bit about how, because we have students that are listening to this as well, how do you address these issues with your students, both at the undergraduate and graduate level?
Yeah. So thanks for asking that, because I'm glad to hear that there are undergraduates and other students around. I think it's amazing to me how much students want to talk about this. They want to understand, they want to learn more. Students are usually really open to seeing, I never knew that. Wow, I had no idea, right? My experience is that students generally want to learn more, know more, understand more. And in many cases, they're craving asking and exploring these big questions that often, at least historically, they would have all been raised in some faith tradition that had some answer to some of these questions, right? And now many of them are not, but they still have the questions. And so they still are seeking to explore them. And I mean, my view is, I teach at a secular university. I don't profess a particular account of any of this. I try to be quite open and to tell them, if you have questions for me about what I think, I am always happy to talk to you. Come make an appointment. And I do get those students. But I see my first role is even introducing them to the idea that this matters. And here's why it might matter. And here's how it might matter. And you're never going to be able to decide for somebody else what their faith means. So be prepared to ask, to listen.
Are your students mainly philosophy or more health?
A lot of my students are headed in the into the health professions.
Okay.
So they're either pre-med or heading into some other health professions program.
Okay.
I run an undergraduate program we have a minor, and we have around 800 students that go through our courses. And we have a master's in bioethics. We have around 70 graduate students. And I would say many of our most popular, based on feedback and course selection, are engaging these questions of the intersection of religion and bioethics. Even from students that aren't religious at all, they find it a needful topic. It also gives, in our increasingly kind of triggered society, that people are afraid of certain of language that may hurt. It gives permission to put ideas into different backgrounds so that you can talk about controversy. A lot of students are afraid to disagree. They're afraid to talk about controversy, and to bring that up front and to make sure that among you are going to be students that disagree profoundly, and try to model a respectful discourse, I think, is one of the best ways of achieving such.
Again, I'll reflect a little bit from my interfaith work. When we began this work in the community, we said we're not interested in thin dialogue and getting some kind of a common denominator that everybody can agree on. We want thick dialogue. Bring the thickness of your faith, but just do it in a sense that you respect the other person bringing their thickness as well. It sounds like that's kind of the principle you're proposing as you discuss these matters.
Right. One of the greatest challenges in doing religious work, and this is a challenge we have there's an annual international conference on medicine and religion that's this year web-based, but Ohio State's one of the co-sponsors, along with Duke and St. Louis University and a few other places. It's a great conference. One of the challenges that we have there, and that Professor Iltis and I have in a journal like the Journal of Christian Bioethics, is trying to get people to move past the ecumenical lowest common denominator. So that's why Tris Engelhardt made the subtitle of the Journal of Christian Bioethics non-ecumenical studies in bioethics. In the conference on medicine and religion, we really encourage speakers to engage at a level that's not always at the ecumenical lowest common denominator, but respectful, but going at the differences, to not be afraid of the scandal of particularity.
I love your description, Dr. Kindschi, of, bring thick dialogue, bring the thickness of your faith. And I imagine that the other side of that equation is be ready to receive that from others. And that's a beautiful way, I think, to kind of promote understanding. If you really care enough to spend the time talking about this, it's because you want to understand and to be understood. And that sounds like how you achieve it. And that doesn't mean agreement, right?
Exactly.
Understanding and agreement are different.
It doesn't mean agreement, but doesn't mean the opportunity to learn and to grow, and to be challenged.
Exactly.
Well, we have a few minutes left, but I want to ask another question from my perspective. You're both very active in what's called Christian bioethics. Have you been involved in an effort to bring multiple faiths, an interfaith effort to say, are there things that are common to our faith traditions, particularly maybe the Abrahamic ones, that can be the basis of a broader yet not secular medical ethics or bioethics?
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was just mentioning the Conference on Medicine and Religion, which I'm a co-director for. It does focus on the Abrahamic faiths. It goes beyond that as well. We've had Hindus and Buddhists as well, but it does focus on the Abrahamic faiths. We don't try to, we do find common touchstones, but we don't want it to just be that. We do want people to feel comfortable to come into the thick dialogue. Within our center, we have a group that does, our faculty include practicing Muslims, Jews, and humanist atheists. So we have a diverse group within us. We try to do at least one grand rounds per year on religion and medicine. So we do engage those aspects. And then I think colloquies like this, groups in our specialties, I think there's many opportunities to have that dialogue. I was asked to be a keynoter at the Libyan Bioethics Society, largely Muslim group. I'm published in the Ibn Sina Journal for Medical Journal, a Muslim journal as well. So I think there is some opportunity.
Dr. Iltis?
Sure. I think there certainly are some of those opportunities. I can't say that I have routinely orchestrated them. I've edited some volumes that have brought people together to address sort of common issues. But to me, a lot of it is in kind of the day-to-day work of encouraging people to recognize what their faith means to be able to say it, to be able to recognize what other people's faith means. And I think one of the things that I have seen that people who are kind of strong adherents of their faith most find most in common with other similarly strong adherents to different faiths is the desire to be heard, to be understood, to have space for that. And that's a starting point. Even if the conclusions are different in many cases, the desire to say, this can be an important part of defining how you understand health, healing, wellness, disease, and the appropriate medical treatment. So I've certainly been involved in some writing projects and other kinds of things and conferences and that sort of thing. I've not been involved in any kind of official capacity in any of that.
Well, another interesting aspect of this interfaith question is that the health communities are probably the most religiously diverse institutions that we have. As an example, in Michigan, the Muslim population is a little less than 3%. The population among medical doctors, 15% of them are Muslim. So these are things that are very important, especially to counter Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and some of the other things that are going on. So on behalf of the Kaufman Interfaith Institute, we are so privileged to have been a partner with this activity of the DeVos Colloquy. And we thank you so much, both of you, for your efforts, not only this evening, but this afternoon. It's been very enriching. And we thank you for your insight and for your willing to share your humanity as well as your expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, thank you.